Hi, everybody, and happy week 10. I'm Leo Schinker, and I'll be presenting on computers and their toxic waste, the export of said waste, and the potential of recycling it. Okay, so first I'm going to start with a few introductory thoughts. So, do you remember one of the previous computers that you've owned? Perhaps you recall how it could perform tasks with ease and conquer whatever you threw at it. Remember when that changed and it began being too slow, prompting you to eventually replace it? How did you get rid of it? Well, if you're like me and most general consumers, you probably ended up just throwing it away. This is the root cause of computer waste, which I'll define as e-waste, short for electronic waste, throughout the rest of this presentation. Alright, so here's a brief overview of what I'm going to be covering in this slideshow. So first, I'll start with what e-waste is, making sure we're all on the same page. Next, I'll highlight the toxic nature of e-waste and its disposal. Then we'll move on to the practice of exporting the said e-waste. And finally, we'll finish with an overview of recycling e-waste. Okay, so what is e-waste? The EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency, defines e-waste as electronics that are nearing the end of their useful life, which are discarded, donated, or given to a recycler. So, as I touched on earlier, e waste is a result of consumers and companies upgrading to newer machines to replace their outdated tech. Most machines, specifically laptops, have a 3 to 5 year useful lifespan before needing to be replaced. This happens for a number of reasons, including outdated hardware that can't handle the new needs of new software, batteries losing their charge potential, and the increased susceptibility of older machines to security breaches. Okay, so Microsoft actually conducted a study to figure out whether replacing machines or updating their older ones was more cost and time effective. And there were a couple key takeaways from this. So the study found that employees spend an average of 1 day waiting for outdated machines to boot up. And their machines are 2.7 times more likely to require repairs by year 3. Additionally, the cost of each machine for the company is about $2,636 per year per device in terms of upkeep. So, what we can take from this is it's overall cheaper to replace the old machines rather than repair them. And this is a major reason why this establishes a sort of precedent for why there's such an abundance of e waste year after year. Alright, so e waste is very toxic to both the human body and the environment. Computer components like circuit boards contain heavy metals such as lead, cadmium, mercury, and other PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls. These are released into the ground as the waste sits in landfills, contaminating water and soil. And you can see that in the bottom image on the right. The water's kind of just soaking up around these old electronics. This eventually leaches all these harmful chemicals into the groundwater, into the soil, etc. And when these components are burned, they actually release these toxins into the air. When humans are exposed to these toxins, they build up in our body, never truly leaving them and eventually increasing the risk of long-term health conditions. So because they're heavy metals, our body has a tough time passing them and they just eventually build up in our bodies. So around 50 metric tons of this e-waste is produced annually. And to put that into perspective, that's 8 of the Great Pyramids of Egypt worth of waste. And China and the US account for over a third of all the world's e-waste. Okay, so now I'll get into the practice of exporting e-waste to other countries. E-waste is shipped to the developing world, both legally and illegally, to keep dangerous materials out of nations who can afford to export this toxic waste. So the legal method of doing so is a result of loopholes in international trade laws. It's legal to export goods to developing nations under the pretense that they are refurbishable. Both the Chinese and U.S. companies have exported e-waste falsely classified as secondhand goods, claiming that they were refurbishable when in fact they were deemed unrefurbishable. And the illegal method of e-waste disposal involves showing up to foreign ports with container ships full of the waste, demanding that it be allowed to be dumped into foreign landfills, And the U.S. has sent container ships full of e-waste to Hong Kong, most of which have been refused entry as they demanded that their cargo be disposed of. And the UN estimates that 10 to 40% of the United States e-waste is exported. And the nations that receive the majority of this export are Ghana and Nigeria in terms of Africa, and the largest recipients in Asia are Hong Kong, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. And taking a look at this map here, as you can see, you have your major sources of e-waste with the countries highlighted in dark blue, and the two major countries being the U.S. and China, as mentioned earlier. And the U.S. ships a lot of their waste over to East Asia, and also to Africa. And you see most of China's e-waste going to other regions of Lower Asia. And all of Europe's e-waste disposal is, well, the majority of it at least, it ends up somewhere in Africa. And it's also important to mention that this e-waste is exported in the first place to processing facilities overseas. One, because of the aforementioned danger of the material, and two, because the labor and environmental safety laws of these processing plants overseas are less rigid, allowing for cheaper handling of the waste. Alright, so the process of recycling e-waste comes with some benefits, like returning materials such as lithium to manufacturers to be reused. Mining lithium is extremely toxic to the environment when compared to recycling it. And lithium has usually been a very common element, but the recent surge in demand creates an increasingly limited supply, so potentially recycling it from old electronics would be something very useful for companies. So the process of recycling e-waste is as follows. First, the e-waste is collected from recycling facilities, often set up by recycling centers or even companies like Apple who accept their own waste. Functional devices will be refurbished, while unfit devices are sent to further processing. Devices are demanufactured, which is a process where components containing hazardous materials are removed before shredding. And shredding the waste allows for valuable materials to be separated, such as iron and steel, which are removed by magnets. Water is then added to the mix to let plastics float to the top, and the remaining material, such as glass, which sinks to the bottom, is collected. And despite this process, as of in the year 2019, only 17% of all declared e-waste produced was actually recycled. And that's all officially declared e-waste. So the unofficial e-waste wasn't accounted for, obviously. And less is recycled each year, unfortunately, as devices like smartphones become lighter, slimmer, and with their batteries being non-removable, like you see in the iPhones. This requires more labor to recycle electronics, making it less appealing for companies to undertake. Laborers also are exposed to the electronics and their disassembled components, which means they're more at risk to heavy metal exposure and developing long-term health conditions. And as mentioned earlier, this is part of the reason why e-waste is exported to regions like Africa and parts of Asia, where companies are able to abuse these less established labor laws. And only 10 of the 60 elements present in e-waste can actually be recycled, those being gold, silver, platinum, cobalt, tin, copper, iron, aluminum, and lead. And all of the discarded e-waste in 2019 was worth approximately $57 billion if recycled. Alright, so the key takeaways from this is e-waste is ultimately a growing problem that needs to be taken seriously by both consumers and companies. And rather than dumping it in other nations, it should be processed correctly and safely in facilities both at home and abroad. Long-term effects of environmental safety and health also need to be prioritized over these short-term profits. Alright, and this is a list of the sources that I used to construct my presentation. Thank you very much for listening in, and I hope you all have a good week 10.